and welcome to Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm political strategist L. Joy Williams, and today we're going to discuss the New York City mayoral race. But first, we want to explore the new president's first 100 days in office. Here with me are political reporters Brigid Bergin and Jeff Mays. Thank you both for being here. So certainly, we're in a new political landscape, a new political reality, and it's just not affecting what's going on in Washington. This new political reality is affecting states all across the country and even our local politics. Brigid, what do you think of the first 100 days as that we're in and how it's affecting our politics overall?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to look at that. I think specifically if you start looking at some of the policies and how some of our local representatives who by and large are, people who've positioned themselves as the polar opposite of this administration. I think one of the things we're watching them struggle with is how to figure out budget priorities locally given the budget that is being shaped on a federal level. And we've seen both from the mayor of New York City and from the governor some real sort of, real strong words and a real big fight over, how to make sure that, they remind this president of where he came from, that he is a guy who's from New York City, and does he really want to be making the types of decisions to funding for Homeland Security, to certainly the American Health Care Act, things that could have real impact on the everyday lives of New Yorkers that run completely counter to what these other lawmakers think should be the priorities.
It seems that from a political standpoint, here in New York, even in the state, certainly downstate, and in the city, it's an easy thing to sort of basically run against or campaign against the current president. And you can win political points that way. But as you're mentioning, when you get down to the budget, like how is that going to play, as we're negotiating our own city budget and resources, and whether or not the president will actually take action against his own home state?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of fear right now. If you look at the hole that's in NYCHA's budget because of the budget that President Trump has proposed, there's a ton of fear right now. And Mayor de Blasio, he set aside some extra money in the city budget supposedly to deal with this, but it's looking right now that maybe that's not enough. The comptroller said that maybe the mayor should have set aside an additional almost $2 billion to deal with potential cuts. But, NYCHA houses 400,000 people in the city, and it is already severely underfunded. The federal government has been cutting the public housing budget for decades now. And so to have an even deeper cut would mean a lot of trouble for people who live in those buildings. And then there's just the everyday fear that people are facing. A lot of people who are immigrants, undocumented immigrants, there's a lot of fear and concern to the point where the city had to issue new guidelines on interaction with federal agents at schools, public schools. So it's wreaking havoc in the city, to be honest, and there's a lot of uncertainty. No one knows exactly how this eventually is going to play out.
So what recourse do we have as a city and as a state in bucking against this administration, right? Certainly we send a lot of tax dollars. Wall Street resides here in this city and in this state. What recourse really do we have to buck up against the system to ensure that we, I guess, be New Yorkers first in our thinking and making sure we take care of our own?
I mean, I think that is the call to action that we're hearing from Mayor de Blasio to people around some of these issues. Just last week, he was in City Hall and he assembled this press conference and surrounded himself by all of his top commissioners, and importantly, Police Commissioner James ONeill was standing right next to him, talking about how devastating the Trump budget could be for the city, and really reinforcing that, when you talk about cuts to something like Department of Homeland Security, which then provides grant money to the NYPD, that you're not just talking about the safety and security of New Yorkers, you're talking about the safety and security of anybody who comes to visit New York City. And that has global implications. And so you're seeing some action being taken on the part of Police Commissioner Bratton. He went down to DC. And then I think also there's a desire to try and energize people to, take the kinds of steps that we've seen recently on the Affordable Health Care Act. So making those calls to representatives, really engaging people in their democracy in a way that maybe they haven't been before, because they're starting to feel something's really at stake for their everyday lives.
Now, certainly we know that even using the current president's own words against him, he's proud to be a New Yorker, and he certainly has boasted throughout the campaign about his commitment to the city, to the state, on issues regarding September 11th and safety and security. And so, are we able to use his own words against him, Jeff, and boasting that up?
I think that was the catchphrase beforehand. Both Mayor de Blasio and Governor Cuomo said, well, you know what? He's a New York City boy. He's a Queens boy. He knows this city. He respects the city. He loves the city. So we think he'll be careful in terms of making those cuts. But that apparently, at least in the proposed budget, hasn't been the case. And then going forward, New York City is a sanctuary city. So it is resisting some of the president's immigration policies in terms of cooperating with federal authorities to deport people. That could carry a further financial consequence. So Trump, as it seems right now, does not seem to be concerned about New York City in particular, even though, as Brigid said, some of that federal anti-terrorism money is going to protect his family and his building at Trump Tower. The city is spending over $400,000 a day to provide protection to that building while the president's wife and child are there. And that is not an issue. And the city still hasn't been reimbursed for the money that is spent to protect Trump Tower from the time of the election through the inauguration.
Do we expect to ever make that happen?
Negotiations are ongoing is what they say, but who knows what that means. And we know the president has a record when it comes to business and other policies of saying one thing and doing another.
Is it possible, we see the conversation or the argument about the president being a New Yorker, being a Queens boy, and sort of using that. And, certainly the mayor is surrounding himself with the police commissioner and others in highlighting these issues. What of Wall Street? What of the wealthy New Yorkers, and what role can they play in advocating for this state and the city which they reside in and make a lot of money in, and how does their activism play in this?
I think that's a good question, and I think as the city starts to sort of feel the impact, if these cuts really do come to fruition and we start to see services decline and things that people take for granted in terms of the sanitation, the certainly security, I think that's when we will start to see Wall Street step in to some degree, and voices of corporate leaders who just don't want New York to lose its stature as being, a hub of commerce, a hub of media, a destination. I think that's when we may see some intervention there, and that may be, just as powerful as, the voices of many people reaching out to the representatives.
Yeah, and certainly we've seen the president be responsive as the market has gone, up. He hails that as a great accomplishment, or that's his, the tracking that he'd like to use and how well his presidency is going.
Right. I mean, I think part of the problem here is even if wealthy people, for example, use their money to support Planned Parenthood, for example, that's not sustainable. These organizations need government funding. So even if you get that initial bump from people resisting the president's policies, the question is what's going to happen over the long term. And certainly it's been set up in a certain way because government funding is necessary to sustain some of these initiatives. They're not going to suffice on private donations alone.
Yeah, I mean, I work in public radio, and the proposed cuts to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting are a huge issue that people are watching, not just because of how it would impact certainly stations in New York City having the advantage of having those same wealthy people that you're talking about being potentially part of the donor base. But when you look at parts of the country where that, a public television station may be one of the few media outlets that is in that locality, and the idea of cutting what could be 60% of their budget, which would shut the station down, and then cut those people off from information, that is a prospect that is a real prospect with this proposed budget, and something that people should be aware of when they're thinking about, what would be the impact of it.
Certainly the president's election and the first 100 days that we're in has ushered in a new wave of activism for the American people in general, right? People are learning more about the impact of their vote or their non-vote and their voice to their elected representatives and going out in the street. And certainly you're seeing more people running for office and commenting to their elected officials. Does that play how does that impact the administration? I certainly see that there's an impact on the individual lawmakers and their responsive thing, but does it make any impact to this administration? Do they hear that?
Well, I mean, this administration, they need lawmakers to pass their ideas. Now the campaign phase is over. So you can say all the rhetoric you want, but when it comes to it, if you want to repeal and replace Obamacare, you're going to have to put forth legislation, and the congressmen and senators are going to have to vote for it and approve it. And that's not happening right now. You see even Dan Donovan out on Staten Island is not voting for this version of the Health Care Act that Trump has put forward. So now is the time to apply that pressure. It's time for voters, residents, people with interest have to apply that pressure and tell their representatives, this is what we want, this is what we don't want.
And there's a big difference between executive orders and, sort of say, and then actually having to negotiate, not in a boardroom, but in Congress, in Washington, D.C., and trying to work with Congress to get a bill passed, like the Health Care Act.
Yeah, and that was the point that Jeff was making that I think is so important. I mean, what we are seeing now is this president is trying to take all of these campaign promises, some of the boldest rhetoric that he put out there, and he's confronting what has been the way Washington has operated now for a long time, and that is, the stagnation and the stalemate, and the legislative process being one that you can't necessarily, use all the might of the presidency to push your idea through. And this healthcare fight is just the first, right? We are going to see this happening over and over again. Proposals to change the tax code. We think this fight is a big fight. By all accounts, that is going to be an even larger fight. And it's clear that this administration doesn't necessarily have the same tools for convincing lawmakers of their message that they had for convincing perhaps people on Twitter or their followers across the country. And that's going to be a challenge.
Yeah.
And then the problem is, as we move towards the midterm election, and as President Trump's approval ratings dip into unseen territories, it's going to be even more difficult if more people are swept out of office, more Republicans are swept out of office. Moving that agenda is going to require some skill, negotiation, bargaining, and this administration so far hasn't shown the willingness to do that, or even the skill, the ability to go in, negotiate with Congress, and get what they want legislatively. And look at the executive orders on immigration. They've been struck down twice now. You can't govern fully by executive orders. You can't overuse that power. There's a system of checks and balances in place.
And certainly the consistency of, as Brigid mentioned, if you fail on health care, if you have this, bloody battle on tax reform, if you have, which I predict would also be a bloody battle on this wall proposal, because how do you pay for it, right? And so if you're cutting programs here and then do tax reform and cut things here, will you have the stamina as an administration to continue all of those big proposals from there? So let's shift locally now. How does all of this going to affect, we talk about midterms, and certainly it's going to have an effect on midterm elections. How is this going to play a role in our mayoral election? You have this big person you can run against, this big piñata you can bang across the city to run against, but in all aspects, aspects from the mayor's race standpoint, is there really any fireworks here?
Well, I think for Mayor de Blasio, the Trump administration is, politically something of a gift, right? It is someone that he can rail against constantly. By and large, New Yorkers, did not vote for Trump. And so it's an opportunity for him to constantly be positioning himself against something and advocating on behalf of the city. And then on the flip side, for the Republicans who are running, there are some, the leading contender right now, who certainly, if you look at the money race, Paul Massey, the Trump administration becomes a challenge for him. He has to position himself, and he's been trying to, as an independent Republican, meaning that he's someone who's not necessarily tethered to this party that is headed by this individual who, by and large, New Yorkers don't have a favorable opinion of. That's tough because it makes it harder for him to build his base within those Republicans who do support Trump in New York City, who there are some, and then to try and appeal to any, disaffected de Blasio supporters and peel them away so that he has enough of a constituency to have a path to victory. He has a real uphill battle. And of course, there are other candidates.
Right. So Jeff, certainly in the primary, the Mayor de Blasio doesn't even have to mention any of the primary candidates' names. He can just continue to, throw Trump, that he's running against Trump, even though there's no real race there. And then if you get to when you get to the general, you can do the same thing as, branding your opponent as being in the same party as Trump.
Right. Well, I think the proof is in the pudding. So Mayor de Blasio has made Trump his foil from election night on. When it was clear that Trump was going to win, the next day he came out guns blazing against Donald Trump and criticisms and fears and concerns. And even when he was being investigated by federal and state authorities regarding his fundraising, it was always about Donald Trump. If you see the fundraising letters that he sends out, it's always about, they don't want me in office. They want to get me out of an office, and they is always Donald Trump. And so right now, New Yorkers are scared. They're concerned about some of the policies coming out of Washington. And Bill de Blasio has wisely set himself up as the city's protector and defender. And he's been out there doing that since November. So now it's going to be hard for a Republican like Paul Massey, as you said, to kind of step in and say, well, I'm going to do something different, because he's a Republican. So people are going to be naturally concerned. Well, Donald Trump is a Republican. Do you believe what he says? And it hasn't helped that Mr. Massey has had some slips along the way. He, for example, didn't have a position on stop and frisk. He's raised a lot of money, but he's also spent a ton of money in this race so far. And it helps Mayor de Blasio that he doesn't have any real Democratic challenger at this point. So using Trump, I don't expect to see that change anytime soon for Mayor de Blasio.
So what really in this municipal election, particularly in the mayor's race, becomes an issue, becomes a way for the voters of New York City to hold the mayor accountable or hold the administration accountable if everything is being scared of the current administration in Washington, D.C., in the White House? What really recourse, what issues can voters of New York City hold Mayor de Blasio's feet to the fire on?
Well, there are lots of issues that the city needs to be talking about, and there are all the issues that an opponent would bring up, and there are all the issues that when the mayor is in settings, when he's in town halls. He has done a fair number of town halls. I think it will be 51 by next month. And at those town halls, he takes 2 hours of questions, and they are unfiltered questions from the community. They're actually pretty fascinating. And people raise a host of issues. Obviously homelessness is still a huge issue. The administration's offered a plan for how to deal with it that involves placing 90 more shelters across the city, with the idea that if you can have a shelter in a neighborhood where someone originally lived, lost their home where they came from, that will help them get back on their feet, stay in their community, know their neighbors, et cetera. But that's not an easy sell, particularly if part of where you plan to put those shelters are in neighborhoods that are already feeling like they provide a lot of those services, and you know, that they become the place that, you know, all those services end up. That's definitely going to be a topic. And affordable housing, you know, this administration put out a plan. They are moving towards this goal of building or preserving 200,000 units of affordable housing. But, you know, when you talk to people, this city is not necessarily getting any more affordable. And so, you know, the administration is fighting an uphill battle. And while they may be making some progress, there's also ground that is just slipping out from underneath people all over the city. People who are either feeling like they won't be able to hold on to their homes, people who have, you know, speculators just circling around them trying to buy up, you know, the very land that they're living on. You know, these issues need to be debated, and it may be up to the press to sort of continue to push the mayor on answering these questions and putting out stories that talk about them, because at this point, there aren't candidates who are having those conversations with him.
And Jeff, to that point, you know, I can imagine that this reelection campaign is going to want to focus on what's happening in Washington and protecting us from there. So is it, Brigid brings up a great point in terms of the press's role in bringing up these local issues, and certainly it's on the mind of every New Yorker's, but will, you know, from a campaign perspective, it's in the best interest of the campaign to continue to focus on Trump. How will that balance play out?
Well, I mean, the press has a job to do, and just the other day they were confronting the mayor in terms of him wanting to not answer specific questions from the media. So I think that's very important that the press continue to press him on these issues, especially if there's not going to be a strong Democratic primary where there's going to be these, you know, a challenger to raise these issues. Part of the problem is that Mayor de Blasio has had some success, right, in his term. You have things like universal pre-K, and crime is still, you know, at record lows. So the question then becomes, you know, what do we judge him on? What can be used? What has he not done well? You know, and are those issues important to ordinary New Yorkers? And homelessness is a major issue. I'm just not sure it's something that the average New Yorker is going to say, well, I'm not going to vote for him based on homelessness. So what you've seen is challengers trying to say, well, he's not a good manager. You know, he goes to the gym every morning, he's lazy, et cetera. But that is not necessarily borne out when he can cite some of his accomplishments. Still, that doesn't mean he should get a free pass this election. So I think the media is going to have to step up its role and just be more ferocious in asking him these questions and pointing out some of these other issues that are not being covered. It can't be all Trump all the time, because this is still New York City.
Right. And then there's the role of what the city council candidates will play, and whether or not they will, you know, already I've seen in my community candidates are running against Trump even though they're only going to represent, you know, a small district within New York City. So how will the city council candidates, of which there will be many, they can play a role also in holding the mayor accountable during this election cycle?
I mean, I think it's an interesting municipal election cycle. We have, you know, the citywide offices where, you know, mayor, public advocate, controller, where it's not clear how interesting those races are going to be. And then we have the city council. And in some of those cases, some of those races may not be that interesting because there's a whole lot of incumbents who are going to be running with, you know, challengers who face the uphill battle of running against an incumbent. There are at least 7 seats where they are going to be open, because an open meaning the people who are currently in those seats will not be able to run because of term limits. So there will be something to watch there. I think there is a participation challenge that is on all of us, the candidates, the media, everyone who's watching these elections, to try and figure out ways to engage the community and engage voters around some of these issues that are important both locally and on the federal level, to help them understand that if they care about what's happening in Washington, if they care about this Trump administration, then they really need to care about their city council race. They need to figure out what the issues are, and they need to understand and participate, because it all starts at, you know, at the grassroots. And there's, you know, the local government plays such a huge role in your everyday life. It's more likely that that person who's your city council member can do something about, that building on your corner that's always been an eyesore, or that park that you really want to get in your community, but you just can't seem to, then the federal government can in changing that.
I think the city council is going to play a huge role, especially if Mayor de Blasio is reelected. He's going to be term limited, and there's going to be a different dynamic between this city council and the incoming city council, because first of all, he's going to be term limited, and his ally, Speaker Melissa Mark Viverito, is also term limited, so she's not going to be there next time. And so knowing that the mayor is going out, there's going to be a much more incentive for people as they jockey for those next leadership roles, those next leadership positions, to not always be as cordial with the mayor. There have been instances where there's been legislation that the city council has wanted to pass, like the Right to Know Act, and they have not been as angry as they were in the past and during a Bloomberg administration in challenging him. I think that's going to change if Mayor de Blasio does win a second term. He's going to have to negotiate more with this council. There are going to be many more people willing to stand up to him, criticize him publicly.
And I think Jeff raises a really good point that the one race that I think will be very interesting to watch is the city council speaker's race.
Absolutely.
And, what role, if the mayor's reelected, does he choose to play in that, since he played such an instrumental role in the election of city council speaker Melissa Mark Viverito? Does he try to, back a candidate? And we already know that there are several folks who are positioning themselves as possible candidates already.
Well, thank you very much for joining me. We could talk about this all day. So I just want to mention, if you are a resident of Harlem, Upper West Side, Washington Heights, Hamilton Heights, or Morningside Heights, there is a special election on May 23rd to fill the state Senate seat for District 30. So visit the Board of Elections website for more information. I want to thank my guests, Brigid Bergin and Jeff Mays, for joining me. And thank you for watching this edition of Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Goodbye.